This is Al Getz with Charting the Territories, and welcome to the Event Center for the Southern California Wrestling Territory, often referred to as NWA Hollywood, promoted by Mike LeBell. And this is a 1 week period of time in the year 1971. We're going to look at all the known house shows that we have records for, talk a little bit about the territory. Then we're also going to look at the data we get from those house show records and try and figure out how many shows that we're missing and what those shows might have looked like. So here is a look at the 8 known house shows we have for this territory. The week beginning Monday, July 26th, 1971. Of course, this territory was based in Los Angeles and ran throughout Southern California. We have records for one show on Monday, the 26th, in Ventura, California. On Tuesday, the 27th, we have records for 2 cards, one held in Northridge and the other held in San Diego. On Wednesday, we have one card for the Olympic in Los Angeles, and this card was actually a hybrid house show / TV taping. The show was aired live on the Spanish language channel. It was also syndicated throughout several markets in the U.S. on a Spanish network. I believe it was definitely aired in Florida and New York, among other places as well. But it was also a house show. It was run in a large venue, the Olympic, and they usually drew a few thousand people to these cards. On Thursday, we have records for cards in Bakersfield and El Monte. On Friday, they again ran Los Angeles and again at the Olympic. And this was a house show that was typically run every other week. They would run the Olympic on Friday nights, and they would run the hybrid house show / TV taping every Wednesday. On Saturday, July 31st, we have records for one house show in San Bernardino, and we have no records for shows on Sunday. Like many territories around this time, they likely did not run house shows regularly, if at all, on Sundays. So now let's take a look at the advertised lineups for all of these cards. We'll start with Monday, July 26th, the card in Ventura, California at the Ventura Fairgrounds. The main event was Mil Mascaras and El Psicodelico taking on Kenji Shibuya and Masa Saito for the Americas Tag Team titles. Also in action, Raul Mata against Black Gordman, Earl Maynard against El Gran Goliath, who in this territory at this time was typically billed simply as Goliath, and Sunni Warcloud against El Gran Marcus. On Tuesday, we have records for 2 cards, the first in Northridge, California at Devonshire Downs. Main event was for the Pacific Coast title, Mil Mascaras versus John Tolos. Also on the card, Raul Mata versus Black Gordman and El Medicos, who were believed not to be any well-known version of the Medics team. But here, one of El Medicos faces Goliath, and the other one took on El Gran Marcus. The other card on Tuesday was held in San Diego, drawing 1,374 fans at the Coliseum, where Kenji Shibuya and Masa Saito faced Don Carson and Earl Maynard in the main event. Also, Sunni Warcloud against Bull Ramos, Apollo versus The Outlaw, and El Psicodelico against Bengali. On Wednesday, they ran the Olympic Auditorium, and this one featured opening matches in a tag team tournament. And entrants in the tournament were the teams of Sunni Warcloud and El Psicodelico, Los Medicos, Mil Mascaras and Don Carson, Black Gordman and Goliath, The Outlaw and Bengali, and John Tolos and Bull Ramos. Also on the card, Raul Mata versus The Masked Texas. And yes, that's how he was billed in this territory. Not sure who he was, but he was billed as The Masked Texas. El Gran Marcus versus Francisco Cruz, and Masa Saito versus Apollo. The first of 2 cards we have records for on Thursday the 29th was held in Bakersfield at Strelitz Stadium. And Kenji Shibuya and Masa Saito took on Mil Mascaras and El Psicodelico. Raul Mata faced Bengali, El Gran Marcus against Sunni Warcloud, and Apollo versus an unnamed opponent. This was not a mystery opponent. It's just it's usually indicates it's one of the preliminary wrestlers, and they didn't either chose not to name them or didn't know which one it was going to be at the time this article ran. Results for the card indicate that his opponent was the Mass Texas. The other card on Thursday was held in El Monte, California at Legion Stadium, featuring a 6-man tag with Goldman Goliath teaming up with John Tolos to face Don Carson, one of Los Medicos, and Earl Maynard. It also advertised a ladies match with Ann Casey and an unnamed opponent who was likely Jane Sherrill. The other Medico, number 2, was scheduled against Bull Ramos, and then they advertised a surprise match. And in cases like this, it's usually 2 of the wrestlers that were in a later tag team match having a warm-up preliminary bout. So one of Goldman Goliath or Tolos against one of Carson, El Medico, or Earl Maynard was almost certainly the opening match on this card. On Friday, July 30th, they ran the Olympic Auditorium, and this card is noteworthy for 2 reasons. First is it may possibly be the first wrestling card in the United States, and perhaps even more than just the United States, to be closed circuit broadcast in other venues. And in this case, they did a closed circuit viewing at the Warrens Theater. The Olympic was typically selling out most every time they had the Friday night house shows, which, as I mentioned earlier, were held every other Friday, almost like clockwork. And the promotion had such a good financial deal, holding the lease on the Olympic, that it didn't make sense for them to try and run a larger venue regularly. For example, the Forum or the Sports Arena, which I believe one of them seated about 14,000, the other seated about 16,000. In this case, they made so much more money with a sellout at the Olympics seating just 9,700 that they wouldn't normally run a bigger venue. Although the other notable thing about this card was that it featured the return of Freddie Blassie after his allegedly career-ending injury that happened at the hands of John Tolos in May. So this card featured Don Carson against John Tolos in a gladiator match. And after the match, which Tolos won, Freddie Blassie came running in from the crowd out of nowhere, still with a bandage over his eye and apparently swinging a chain like a madman. And as he hit the ring, Tolos powdered, bailed, and ran for the hills. And this would set up the card at the LA Coliseum, which was going to be held 4 weeks later on August 27th. So as I said, they typically didn't run a larger venue for the Friday night house shows, but in this case, they were building up. Since they did the angle in May, it was all to build up for the main event at the huge outdoor venue, the LA Memorial Coliseum, which seated over 90,000 people at capacity. So this card was the first ever card in the US to be closed circuit broadcast. And it also featured the return of Freddie Blassie to set up the main event for the largest card that Mike LeBell ever was going to run. Also on this card, Mil Mascaras against Bull Ramos, Raul Mata versus Gran Marcus, Goldman and Goliath versus Los Medicos, and Earl Maynard and Sunny Warcloud versus Kenji Shibuya and Masa Saito, with an opening match of El Psicodelico versus Apollo. Now you can also see on this article a mention of the TV card that was going to happen the following night. We mentioned that the Wednesday card was aired live and then syndicated for Spanish language television, but the English language version of their TV show was aired live on Saturday nights from KCOP Channel 13 in Los Angeles. I believe it would then be bicycled out to some of the other markets in the territory, but I'm not sure of that. But here, in this case, they're advertising Ann Casey versus Jane Sherrill for that Saturday night live TV card. And here we see it begins at 7 o'clock. And that's noteworthy because they ran at least one house show also on Saturday night. And here we have records for a card in San Bernardino. And here in this article, you can see it advertises that the TV would start at 7 p.m. But then there's a card beginning at 9 p.m. in San Bernardino with Kenji Shibuya versus Mil Mascaras. Also advertised on the card, Raul Mata, Los Medicos, John Tolos, Bull Ramos. For some reason, Raul Mata is listed twice. El Gran Marcus, El Psicodelico, and Goliath. So here we can see with the late start time and San Bernardino being an hour away from Los Angeles, maybe a little more drive time, it's certainly feasible that the wrestlers could do the live TV. And as the guys finish up their match or their angle on the TV, they would shoot into a couple of cars and head on over to San Bernardino. And now let's take a look at our records for these 8 house shows and see if we can use a little what I call data magic to figure out how many cards we're missing. So here I have a spreadsheet. On the left-hand side are the baby faces in the territory. On the right-hand side are the heels, and they're listed in their approximate position on the roster using our spot rating metric. So the bigger stars are listed on top, and the preliminary wrestlers are listed on the bottom. And I also want to note Francisco Cruz, who's listed on the bottom left. He was not only a preliminary wrestler, but he was a very part-time wrestler. I only think we have a couple of records for him over the course of the year. So he's not a regular in the territory. But here we can see on Monday, all the wrestlers that were booked in Ventura. I indicated those by putting a VEN in that column for Monday the 26th. And as we can see here, about half the crew was booked in Ventura, which means there almost certainly was another house show on this night. You can see both Don Carson and John Tolos were not booked in Ventura. They very likely would have been the main event of this other card. Also unbooked were, on the babyface side, Los Medicos and Apollo. And on the heel side, Bull Ramos. And the preliminary wrestlers, the Outlaw, Bengali, and the Mass Texas. So probably 2 of those would have been booked on this card, with another one getting the night off. On Tuesday, we have records for shows both in Northridge and San Diego, and you can see pretty much every wrestler working in the territory at the time was booked on one of those 2 shows. The only ones that weren't were the Mass Texas and Francisco Cruz, who, as we mentioned earlier, isn't being booked regularly. On Wednesday for the card at the Olympic, the hybrid house show / live TV, the entire crew except for 2 wrestlers were booked for matches. So you can see both Earl Maynard and Kenji Shibuya were not scheduled for a match. It's very possible that both of them were on hand. In particular, since Shibuya was teaming up with Saito, perhaps he was at ringside accompanying him, and perhaps they did some sort of an angle afterwards where the 2 of them attacked Saito's opponent, leading Earl Maynard to come in to make the save, or he might have just been hanging out backstage in case someone got hurt or didn't appear. On Thursday the 29th, we have records for cards in Bakersfield and El Monte, and once again, pretty much the entire crew is booked. We mentioned that Apollo had been advertised against an opponent to be named later, and here, since we know the opponent ended up being the Mass Texas, we put him in and highlighted him in blue. So the only wrestlers not booked for either of these 2 cards were the Outlaw and Francisco Cruz. The Friday night card at the Olympic, again, the whole crew is booked except for some of the preliminary wrestlers. As a matter of fact, all 3 preliminary heels, the Outlaw, Bengali, and Mass Texas, were unbooked because these were typically the loaded up house shows featuring all the top stars in big matches. So they gave the preliminary guys the night off, although they may have been on hand at the show in case somebody got hurt or didn't appear. Perhaps we're helping setting up the ring, or we're just there to observe and learn. And on Saturday, we have records for the 1 house show in San Bernardino. There are enough wrestlers unbooked for there to be another card, but again, given that they taped live TV on Saturday night, it would have needed to be very, within reasonable driving distance of Los Angeles. But we do see on the babyface side, both Don Carson and Earl Maynard weren't booked in San Bernardino. On the heel side, Saito and Gordman. And then a little further down the card, at the babyface side, Sunni Warcloud and Apollo. And on the heel side, the Outlaw and Bengali. So while that is definitely enough wrestlers to have an extra card, it would have been either would have been a card located within an hour's driving time of Los Angeles, or it would have been a case where those wrestlers were not booked to work the live TV on Saturday night. An article in the 1972 paper lists the schedule for this territory, and the second card on Saturday nights was held in a town named El Centro. El Centro is about 3.5 hours drive from Los Angeles. So if that's where this second card was held on this particular night, those wrestlers would not have been able to appear on the live TV. As far as the missing card on Monday, based on that 1972 article, I believe it would have been held in Costa Mesa. So we have records for 8 cards, and we're almost certain that in total there were 10 cards. So we're missing 2, which means for this particular week, our records are 80% complete because we have 8 out of 10 shows. For more on Southern California Wrestling Territory in 1971, be sure to visit chartingtheterritories.com and also be on the lookout for the August episode of the Charting the Territories podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you get your favorite wrestling podcasts. We're going to talk more about the big angle between Freddie Blassie and John Tolos and that big card held on August 27th, 1971 at the LA Memorial Coliseum. Thanks for watching this. And of course, if you have any questions or comments, be sure to reach out to me, Al Getz, at chartingtheterritories@gmail.com. You can also reach me on X, the app formerly known as Twitter, at Al Getz Wrestling. That's Al, Getz Wrestling. Be sure to X me or re-X me or X-each me or whatever the heck we are going to start calling these things now that Twitter is known as X. So once again, thanks for joining me. I'm Al Getz, signing off from the Event Center.